The Tyranny of Language, on the definite article and the question of being. This essay re-examines the question of being by interrogating the linguistic structures through which it is posed. While Heidegger famously reopens the question and embraces its apparent circularity as a necessary condition of inquiry, insufficient attention has been given to the role language itself plays in shaping that circularity. In particular, the definite article, seemingly insignificant, functions as a micro-ontological operator, introducing unity, stability, and referability prior to reflection. The phrase, the being, thus risks presupposing the very coherence it seeks to uncover. Building from this insight, the essay argues that not all linguistic elements are ontologically neutral. Certain structures carry disproportionate weight in determining what can appear as meaningful. The term being, further, is shown to compress distinct dimensions of identity and process into a single form, encouraging the treatment of dynamic relational emergence as if it were a stable entity. These effects are not merely semantic but structural, shaping the field within which intuition and interpretation operate. In response, the essay situates being within a broader framework of relational emergence, drawing on the concept of Phainesis as the appearing of reality without fixed ground. From this perspective, what has traditionally been called being may be better understood as a recurring relational constant, a pattern of persistence under the condition of possible non-being, rather than a singular ontological ground. The definite article, in turn, is revealed as a mechanism of premature closure, transforming distributed relational processes into unified reference. The task is therefore not to abandon language, nor to eliminate the term being, but to recognize and discipline the ontological load carried by linguistic forms. By exposing how language both discloses and constrains, this essay seeks to prevent the reintroduction of closure into an ontology committed to openness, relationality, and ongoing emergence. 1. The question reopened, and already shaped. Few philosophical gestures have been as decisive as Martin Heidegger's reopening of the question of being. Against a tradition that had long treated being as self-evident or exhausted, Heidegger insists that the question has not been answered, but forgotten. What is required, he argues, is not the construction of a new system, but the recovery of a more originary inquiry. What does it mean for something to be? This reopening is accompanied by a second, equally important move. Heidegger acknowledges that the question of being appears circular. We ask about being while already standing within an understanding of being. Rather than treating this as a flaw, he reinterprets it as a condition of possibility. Inquiry does not begin from neutrality, but from within a field that is already operative. The circle, in this sense, is not vicious but generative. It marks the recursive structure of understanding itself. Yet this recognition, while profound, may not go far enough. For the question is not only whether inquiry is circular, but how that circle is formed. If we do not begin from nowhere, then we must ask not only what is already understood, but how it is being held in place. The very formulation of the question, its grammar, its terms, its structure, may already participate in shaping what can appear as an answer. What presents itself as a neutral beginning may, in fact, be a conditioned entry point. It is here that a seemingly insignificant element demands attention. The question of being is rarely posed without the definite article. We do not simply ask about being. We ask about the being, or about the meaning of the being of beings. This inclusion is so habitual as to pass unnoticed. It appears to do no more than specify its referent. Yet, this assumption deserves scrutiny, for the definite article does more than indicate. It gathers. It presents what it names as sufficiently unified, sufficiently coherent, to be referred to as a singular term. In doing so, it introduces a subtle but decisive shift. What is being questioned is already positioned as something that can be held together, pointed toward, and ultimately grasped. Before the inquiry begins, a certain kind of stability has already been installed. This does not mean that the question is thereby invalid, but it does suggest that the field of inquiry may already be structured in advance. The circularity Heidegger identifies may not arise solely from the nature of understanding, but also from the way the question is linguistically framed. If the question begins from an assumed unity, however minimal, then the movement of inquiry may be predisposed to return to that unity, elaborating what was never entirely in question. The issue, then, is not merely that we are within a circle, but that the circle may be partially constructed by the language through which we enter it. This observation does not yet overturn Heidegger's project. On the contrary, it deepens it. For if the question of being is to be reopened in a genuinely originary way, then it must also confront the conditions under which it becomes askable at all. Among these conditions, language cannot remain unexamined. It is not only the medium through which the question is expressed, but potentially one of the forces that shapes its trajectory from the outset. To attend to this is not to reject the question of being, but to ask it more rigorously, not only what is being, but what has already been assumed when it is spoken as the being. 2. The quiet work of the definite. If the reopening of the question of being requires attention to its conditions, then the definite article can no longer be treated as negligible. Its function is so familiar that it disappears into the background of thought. Yet precisely in this disappearance lies its force. What operates without notice is often what operates most decisively. The definite article does not simply accompany a noun, it performs a quiet act of gathering. Where an indefinite expression leaves something open, one among many, not yet fixed, the definite article presents its referent as already determined enough to be singled out. It does not argue for unity, it assumes it. It does not demonstrate coherence, it implies it. In doing so, it establishes a minimal but consequential form of closure. This closure is subtle. It does not declare that what is named is complete or fully known. Rather, it suggests that it is sufficiently bounded to be treated as a unit of reference. That suggestion is enough. For once something is rendered referable, it becomes available for inquiry as though it were already gathered into a kind of provisional whole. In everyday language, this function is indispensable. Without it, communication would dissolve into indeterminacy. We rely on definiteness to coordinate attention, to distinguish this from that, to make shared reference possible. In this context, the work of the definite article is pragmatic and necessary. The difficulty arises when this pragmatic function is extended into ontology. When we speak of the being, the definite article no longer merely facilitates communication. It begins to carry ontological weight. It presents being as something that can be gathered into a single referent, even if that referent remains obscure or contested. The question is thereby framed as if there were something, however elusive, that holds together enough to be approached as one. This framing introduces more than unity. It carries with it a sense of completion, not in the sense that being is fully known, but in the sense that it is already sufficiently formed to be the target of inquiry. There is an implicit teleological effect. What is named appears as though it has arrived enough to be questioned. The movement of inquiry thus begins not from open emergence, but from an assumed point of coherence. It is here that the earlier sense of circularity returns in a new light. If the question begins by treating being as a unified referent, then the subsequent effort to understand it may be predisposed to recover that unity in more articulated form. The circle is no longer only hermeneutic, it is also linguistic. The beginning already contains, in compressed form, the shape of the end. This does not mean that every use of the definite article produces distortion. Its role in ordinary language remains largely benign, precisely because it does not attempt to ground or totalize. But when it is paired with terms that carry ontological ambition, its effect changes. It becomes a micro-operator of stabilization, quietly transforming what may be distributed, relational, or emergent, into something that appears singular and graspable. To notice this is not to propose that we can simply remove the definite article and thereby purify the question. Language does not yield so easily. The point is rather to recognize that the form of our questioning is not neutral. Even at the smallest scale, grammar participates in shaping what can appear as meaningful. If this is so, then the question of being must be approached with a new caution. It is not only that we must avoid premature answers, but that we must attend to the ways in which the question itself may already carry a form of answer within it. The definite article, in its quiet work, may be one of the sites where such answers are first installed. 3. The compression of being. If the definite article stabilizes what is named, the term being introduces a different, but equally significant operation. Where "the" gathers, being compresses. It brings into a single word what may in fact be a tension between distinct dimensions. In its most ordinary usage, the verb to be functions across multiple roles without difficulty. We say, "I am a person," and refer to identity. We say, "I am running," and refer to activity. We say, "it is," and gesture toward presence. These uses coexist seamlessly in everyday language, and their ambiguity rarely causes confusion. Context carries the distinction. Yet when this same term is elevated into an ontological category, when it becomes being, this flexibility becomes problematic. What, in ordinary usage, remains differentiated by context is now drawn together into a single conceptual form. Identity, process, and presence are no longer merely related. They are implicitly unified. This unification is rarely made explicit. It appears as though being names something fundamental, something prior to all distinctions. But, in doing so, it risks obscuring the very differences it contains. What something is and what something is doing, its persistence and its unfolding, are not identical. They may be inseparable in experience, but they are not interchangeable. To collapse them into a single term is to conceal a tension that may be ontologically significant. The consequence of this compression becomes visible when being is treated as an object of inquiry. If being contains both identity and process, then asking about being invites a subtle shift. Process begins to appear as though it were a kind of state. Becoming is recast as a mode of being, rather than as something that resists stabilization. What unfolds is quietly drawn toward what persists. This is not merely a semantic issue. It shapes how reality is conceived. If process is consistently interpreted through the lens of identity, then emergence is understood in terms of what it becomes, rather than in terms of its ongoing transformation. The dynamic is translated into the static, not by argument, but by grammar. Here, the earlier analysis of the definite article returns with greater force. When being is paired with the effects compound. The compression of identity and process is now further stabilized into a singular referent. The being appears as something that both is and holds within itself the unfolding of what is. The result is a kind of pseudo-object, not an entity in the usual sense, but something treated as if it could be approached, examined, and ultimately understood as a unified whole. It is important to note that this construction has been extraordinarily productive within the history of philosophy. It has allowed for the articulation of questions that would otherwise remain diffuse. It has enabled coherence, continuity, and the development of systematic thought. The issue, then, is not that it is simply mistaken. The issue is that it may overreach. What appears as a fundamental unity may in fact be the result of linguistic compression. What is taken to be a basic feature of reality may be, at least in part, an artifact of how language organizes experience. If this is so, then the task is not to abandon the term being, but to loosen the hold it exerts. It must be returned from a position of authority to one of provisional use. This loosening opens a space in which the tension between identity and process can be held without immediate resolution. It allows for the possibility that what is most fundamental is not a unified is, but an ongoing interplay that resists final capture in a single term. To pursue this possibility, however, requires that we look beyond the inherited compression of being and attend more closely to how reality appears prior to its stabilization in language. 4. Language, intuition, and the shaping of the field. If the definite article stabilizes and being compresses, then the question arises as to how deeply these operations penetrate. It might be tempting to respond that their effects are limited, that interpretation ultimately depends on the reader, that meaning is guided by intuition, and that language remains flexible enough to accommodate multiple directions of thought. There is truth in this. Language does not determine a single meaning. The phrase being can be interpreted as static or dynamic, as substance or as process. Readers can resist, reinterpret, and stretch the terms they encounter. No single formulation fully fixes what is thought. Yet this flexibility should not be mistaken for neutrality. Interpretation does not occur in an open void. It unfolds within a field that is already structured. Language does not dictate a single path, but it does delimit the range of paths that can be meaningfully taken. It provides a space of intelligibility, a set of possible directions within which intuition moves. To say that meaning depends on interpretation is therefore only partially correct. Interpretation itself operates within constraints that are often invisible. This is where the work of language becomes most difficult to detect. It does not impose rigid conclusions. Instead, it shapes the conditions under which conclusions can appear plausible. It biases thought towards certain forms of coherence, unity, stability, referability, while making other possibilities, distributedness, non-finality, relational emergence, more difficult to sustain without strain. The earlier example of the being illustrates this clearly. One can attempt to understand being as dynamic, temporal, or relational. Heidegger himself undertakes precisely such a project. Yet the phrase continues to suggest, however subtly, that what is being described holds together as a kind of unit. The effort to think being as unfolding must work against a linguistic tendency that presents it as something that already is. This tension reveals an asymmetry. Language offers multiple interpretive pathways, but not all pathways are equally supported. Some align with its structuring tendencies and thus feel intuitive. Others require sustained effort to maintain, as they run counter to the forms of coherence language more readily provides. From this perspective, intuition cannot be treated as an independent arbiter. What feels immediate or natural may already be shaped by the linguistic environment within which it operates. The apparent faithfulness of language, its seeming ability to transparently express what is meant, may be less a sign of accuracy than of alignment between its structures and the expectations those structures have helped produce. This does not render language unusable. It does, however, complicate its status. Language is not merely a medium through which thought is expressed. It is a medium through which thought is formed. It both discloses and constrains. It opens a field of meaning while simultaneously shaping its contours. To recognize this is to deepen the earlier concern. The question is no longer only whether the being introduces premature stability, but whether the very intuition that finds such stability natural has been conditioned by the linguistic forms through which it is encountered. The problem of ontology thus becomes inseparable from the problem of its expression. What can be thought is entangled with how it is said. If this entanglement is ignored, then even the most careful attempt to think beyond static being risks being drawn back into it. The language that enables the articulation of emergence may also quietly reshape it into something more stable than it is. To move further, then, requires not only conceptual revision, but an increased sensitivity to the structuring effects of language itself. 5. From being to Phainesis. If the question of being is shaped by the linguistic structures through which it is posed, then a further step becomes possible. Rather than attempting to purify the concept of being, to refine it, clarify it, or rescue it from its ambiguities, we may instead ask whether it remains the most adequate term for what is being sought. The preceding analysis has suggested two pressures. First, that being as a term compresses distinct dimensions, identity, and process into a single form. Second, that when paired with the definite article, it is drawn toward singularization, presented as a unified referent. Even when these tendencies are resisted, they continue to exert influence, shaping both intuition and interpretation. What emerges from this tension is not simply a need for caution, but the possibility of a shift. Phainesis names such a shift. It does not begin from the assumption of unity, nor from the search for an underlying ground. Instead, it points to the ongoing appearing of reality as relational emergence. What is given is not a stable is, but a field of manifestation, in which observer, observed, and their relation co-constitute one another. This field is not secured by a fixed foundation. It persists through the continuous negotiation of its own conditions. Within this perspective, what has been called being can be reconsidered. Rather than a singular ontological ground, it may be understood as a recurring pattern within this field. The persistence of relation under the constant possibility of its failure. Wherever relation does not collapse, where coherence, however provisional, is maintained, something like being can be said to occur. But this occurrence is not a thing. It is not a unity that can be gathered into a single referent. It is a recurrence, distributed across the field of appearing. This reframing dissolves the need for the being as an object of inquiry. There is no singular entity to be uncovered, no unified ground to be described. What remains is a dynamic interplay in which stability and instability are continuously negotiated. The emphasis shifts from what is to how what appears continues to hold together at all. Importantly, this does not entail the abandonment of the term being. The word can still function as a provisional marker, a way of gesturing toward the persistence of relational coherence. But it no longer occupies a foundational position. It does not explain. It indicates. It does not ground. It points to a pattern within what is already unfolding. Phainesis, in this sense, does not replace being so much as displace its authority. It relocates the site of inquiry from a presumed unity to an ongoing process of emergence. What matters is not the identification of a stable ontological category, but the tracing of how relational structures appear, persist, and transform. This shift also reframes the earlier problem of language. If reality is understood as relational, appearing rather than as a unified ground, then the task of language changes. It can no longer aim to capture a stable referent. Instead, it must operate with an awareness of its own tendency to stabilize, to singularize, to close. Its role becomes more tentative, more provisional, more attentive to the limits of what it can hold without distortion. The movement from being to Phainesis is thus not a rejection, but a reorientation. It preserves what was most compelling in the question of being, the concern with how anything can appear at all, while releasing it from the linguistic structures that have quietly constrained its expression. 6. The discipline of saying. If Phainesis displaces the authority of being, and if language is both the medium and the constraint of this displacement, then the final task is neither conceptual nor purely critical. It is practical. It concerns how we speak. The temptation at this point is to respond with prohibition, to abandon the term being, to avoid the definite article, to attempt a purified vocabulary free from the distortions that have been identified. But such a move would repeat, in inverted form, the very gesture it seeks to escape. It would replace one form of closure with another, substituting restriction for awareness, rule for responsiveness. What is required instead is discipline. Discipline here does not mean adherence to a fixed method. It means a sustained attentiveness to the work language is doing as it is being used. Words cannot be rendered neutral, but their force can be tracked. The question becomes not whether a term is permissible, but what role it is playing within a given articulation. The term being offers a clear example. It need not be eliminated. It can still function as a provisional marker for relational persistence, a way of indicating that something holds together rather than collapsing into non-being. But it must be prevented from hardening into a singular ground. The moment it begins to carry explanatory finality, when it appears to answer rather than to point, it exceeds its proper scope. The same holds for the definite article. It cannot be removed from language, nor should it be. Its role in everyday communication is indispensable. Yet when it is attached to terms that aspire to ontological significance, its effect must be recognized. It introduces a minimal closure, a suggestion of unity that may not belong to what is being described. To use it without awareness is to risk reintroducing, at the level of grammar, the very stability one seeks to question. This discipline extends beyond individual words to the broader structure of articulation. Language tends toward coherence, toward the formation of units that can be grasped and retained. This tendency is not itself a problem. It becomes problematic when it is mistaken for a feature of reality rather than a feature of expression. The task, then, is to allow coherence to emerge where it is warranted, while resisting the impulse to impose it where it is not. Such resistance does not produce clarity in the conventional sense. It does not yield definitive statements or final formulations. Instead, it produces a different kind of precision, a precision that remains aware of its own limits, that marks rather than resolves tensions, that allows what is being articulated to remain open. This mode of saying is necessarily more demanding. It requires constant adjustment, a willingness to revise, to qualify, to hold multiple dimensions in play without collapsing them into a single term. It also requires a different relation to understanding. Insight is no longer measured by the stability of its conclusions, but by its capacity to remain responsive to what exceeds them. In this light, the earlier concerns with circularity take on a new significance. If inquiry is indeed recursive, if it moves within a field it cannot step outside, then discipline becomes the means by which that movement avoids stagnation. The circle is not escaped, but it is not left unattended. Its structure is examined, its pressures identified, its tendencies counterbalanced. The question of being, then, is not abandoned. It is transformed. It is no longer directed toward the discovery of a singular ground, but toward the ongoing clarification of how relational appearing persists without such a ground. In this transformation, language remains indispensable, but it is no longer taken for granted. It becomes an active site of attention, a field in which the tension between disclosure and distortion must be continually negotiated. To speak under these conditions is not to fix what is, but to participate in its ongoing articulation, aware that what is said will always both reveal and reshape what appears. 7. After being. What remains, once being is displaced from its position as ground, is not a void, but a shift in orientation. The absence of a singular ontological center does not dissolve coherence. It relocates it. Coherence is no longer assumed as given, nor guaranteed by an underlying unity. It is something that must be continually maintained within the field of relational appearing. This maintenance is neither arbitrary nor purely subjective. It unfolds within constraints, patterns, recurrences, and tensions that do not depend on any single observer, yet do not exist apart from relational conditions. What has been called being can now be seen as one such pattern, not a foundational presence, but a recurring feature of how relations persist without collapsing. It is, in this sense, a constant, not in the sense of fixity, but in the sense of recurrence across variation. To recognize this is to release the need for singularization. There is no longer a requirement to gather what appears into a unified referent in order to make it intelligible. Intelligibility arises within the interplay itself, through the ways in which relations hold, shift, and reconfigure. The question is no longer directed toward what being is, but toward how coherence continues to arise at all. This reorientation also alters the status of philosophical inquiry. Philosophy is no longer tasked with uncovering an ultimate ground or providing a final account. Its role becomes more modest and more demanding at once. It must track the conditions under which appearing takes place, attend to the ways in which coherence is sustained, and remain alert to the points at which language introduces premature closure. In this sense, the critique of language does not end in skepticism. It does not undermine the possibility of thought. Rather, it refines it. By exposing how linguistic structures shape what can be thought, it allows for a more deliberate engagement with those structures. It becomes possible to use language without being entirely used by it. Heidegger's insight that we are always already within the circle remains intact. What changes is our understanding of that circle. It is no longer taken as a purely ontological condition, but as a configuration in which language, thought, and relation are intertwined. The circle is not escaped, but it is no longer left unexamined. Its contours are recognized as partially shaped by the very means through which we move within it. The result is not a new foundation, but a different kind of openness. An openness that does not seek to secure itself through final terms, but that remains responsive to the ongoing emergence of what appears. In this openness, the question of being does not disappear. It persists, but in altered form, no longer as a search for a singular answer, but as an inquiry into the conditions under which any answer can arise. If there is a conclusion to be drawn, it is not that language must be abandoned, nor that being must be denied. It is that both must be held differently. Language must be approached as an active participant in the shaping of ontology, not as a neutral vessel. Being must be understood not as a fixed ground, but as a provisional marker within a broader field of relational emergence. In this way, the tyranny of language is neither overthrown nor ignored. It is recognized, engaged, and, to the extent possible, tempered. What remains is not freedom from language, but a more attentive way of dwelling within it, one that allows what appears to remain open, even as it is said. 8. Coda. On saying without closure. If the preceding movement has led from the question of being to the interrogation of language, and from there to the reorientation toward Phainesis, then what remains is not a final position, but a changed posture toward saying itself. For the difficulty has not been resolved, it has been clarified. We still speak, we still rely on words that stabilize, compress, and render referable. We still say is, still invoke being, still reach, at times, for the definite article as though what we name could be gathered. These cannot be abandoned without abandoning articulation altogether. Yet they can no longer be used innocently. To speak, under these conditions, is to remain aware that what is said exceeds what is meant, and that what is meant is shaped by how it is said. There is no purified language waiting to be discovered beyond this tension. There is only a more careful engagement with it. This care does not aim at silence, nor at fragmentation. It aims at a different kind of coherence, one that does not depend on premature closure. Coherence here is not the reduction of multiplicity into unity, but the capacity to hold relations in play without forcing them into a single frame. It is sustained not by fixing what appears, but by allowing it to remain responsive to its own conditions. Such a mode of saying will often appear incomplete. It will hesitate, qualify, return upon itself. It will resist the temptation to conclude where tension remains. This is not a failure of thought, but a recognition of its situation, where the object of inquiry is not a stable ground, but an ongoing emergence. The form of articulation must reflect that condition. In this sense, the earlier concern with circularity finds its resolution not in escape, but in transformation. The circle remains, but it is no longer taken as a closed loop. It becomes a movement, one that revisits its starting points not to confirm them, but to rework them in light of what has emerged. Language participates in this movement, not as a fixed structure, but as a field that can be inhabited with varying degrees of awareness. The question of being, then, is neither answered nor dismissed. It is displaced. It no longer stands as the central axis around which ontology must turn. In its place, there is a more diffuse, but also more precise concern: how what appears continues to appear without collapsing into either fixed unity or incoherent fragmentation. To remain with this concern is to accept that philosophy cannot secure itself through final terms. It must instead remain attentive to the interplay between what is encountered, how it is formed, and how it is said. This interplay cannot be resolved once and for all. It must be navigated, again and again, within the limits and possibilities of language. If there is a final word, it is only this: that the task is not to escape language, nor to master it, but to dwell within it, in such a way that what exceeds it is not immediately reduced. In that dwelling, the tension between saying and what is said is not eliminated. It is preserved, held open as the very space in which thought continues. What has been called being is not lost, but released, from unity into relation, from ground into appearing, and from certainty into the ongoing work of saying. The ground is open.